Fidel. He's an expert in military law and an attorney with the firm Feldsman, Tucker, Leeper, and Fidel in Washington, D.C. A former judge advocate in the Coast Guard, he's the senior research scholar in law and Florence Rogat's visiting lecturer in law at Yale Law School and president emeritus of the National Institute of Military Justice. I first met Jean Fidel in 2009, and he and Dr. Kristen Leslie coordinated a conference between Yale Law School and Yale Divinity School titled Faith in Arms in a Democratic Society, a working conference on religion in the military. And that conference was really a forerunner to the one I think also we're having today. It brought together military chaplains, attorneys, legal scholars, ethicists, and theologians who had done work on the constitutional and pastoral aspects of military chaplaincy. There's a nice clip I read from an NBC News piece that I'm just going to end this introduction with. That Jean Fidel has eagerly taken on the most complex legal questions of the 21st century American military. The future of Guantanamo Bay, the fate of Private Chelsea Manning, the role of commanders in prosecuting sexual assault, and many of us would say issues related to religion and the military chaplaincy. We welcome Jean Fidel.
All of us have probably spoken at conferences, and thank you very much. All of us have spoken at conferences at one time or another. You know, the worst time is when you're the last person on the conference, and people, you know, they think, oh, I've got to get the load before my train is about to leave. The next to worst time is immediately after a meal.
Move closer to the mic, by chance?
Well, I can do that. Is it better?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So the next to worst time is immediately after a meal. People may be dozing off, which in turn makes me think of something that was once said about John Marshall Harlan, who was a justice of the Supreme Court, the grandfather of the one that you probably remember from the 50s and 60s. Also John Marshall Harlan, but the old man who served until I think 1911, served about 30 years. When he died, somebody said of him that he slept each night with one hand on the Bible and the other on the Constitution, and so slept the sleep of the just and the righteous. So please don't let me see you dozing off. I want to say that I'm very happy to be here. Number one, what a great afternoon. I mean, seriously, to get the juices flowing. I'm always delighted to come back to Boston. It's probably my favorite city. It also brings me back to BU, where when I was on active duty, I spent many hours at the law library right around the block, researching one of the first things I wrote for publication. That article, which actually appeared thanks to my friend Richard Narva, also at Constituion, had to do with maritime law enforcement. And all I can say is that I hope this evening to discuss with you a topic that will be somewhat less fishy. Okay, all right. So, as I was listening this afternoon, I actually, this is not in my prepared remarks, I found myself during the afternoon thinking about cases that I've had that individually and cumulatively suggest the range of points of contestation, let's say, that occur in the world of faith in uniform. I'll run through a few of these for you. My mind was sort of not struggling to make this list, but this is what came out in just a few minutes. I had occasion to represent a chaplain who was a reservist who appeared on a panel having to do with nuclear war. And he expressed the view that there were some religious problems of a religious nature in nuclear warfare. In the audience was an Army reservist. He was an Army reservist. In the audience was an Army reservist who dutifully shared this information with the authorities, and the Army proceeded to revoke this chaplain's clearance. Fast forward, at the end of the day, maybe 2 years later, the Secretary of the Army, or the General Counsel of the Army, issued an apology to that chaplain. It's one of about 4 apologies. I've practiced law since 1968. That's, I think, one of 4 apologies I've seen from a government official. Just saying. I represented a woman who was subject to anti-Semitic discrimination in the Navy. Did I mention that she was actually born again and happened to have a Jewish name? That was apology number 2. That was resolved. And hats off to Senator Nunn and then Secretary John Warner. I think he was the secretary at the time. I represented a man, he was quite elderly when I represented him. He had joined the U.S. Coast Guard during President Wilson's 2nd term. He was a career guy who made it to warrant officer, and then during World War II made it to lieutenant commander. On September 1st, 1939, a not insignificant date, he received a fitness report in which the reporting officer commented, as a matter of praise, that he did not share the usual traits of his race. Hyman G. Gottlieb. He was a tough old goat, but God, he was proud when he got his promotion to lieutenant commander through the system. I had a case in which a junior officer who was quite irreligious. He was, I think the family was Episcopalian, son of an Army colonel. He had the bad luck to work for a fellow who was very energized evangelical Christian. And the unit was called upon to travel to Eastern Europe, Romania, in fact. Things went south when the commander of this unit, it's a small unit, the commander of this unit was overheard at a diplomatic reception saying to some Romanian official, "How do you say Christ is risen in Romanian?" Romania at the time was a communist country. This led to a diplomatic stink and a terrible fitness report, and that ultimately got resolved. Did I mention about the box of Bibles that the commanding officer had imported at government expense to Romania? For the mandatory prayer sessions? I've represented a number of chaplains, actually, from a variety of faith groups. And chaplains, how many of you were chaplains? Come on. Okay. I'm going to make a comment that it's extremely interesting representing clergy. No. Aside from the fact, if you're intellectually interested in the subject and the profession, and if you are personally, of faith. And how many of you have ever had occasion, well, don't raise your hands. I imagine some of you have had occasion to consult an attorney over one thing or another, or know people who have had to do that. most legal disputes, even disputes with the government, are resolved informally. They're settled on one basis or another. And usually, when you are having a settlement, one party moves a little bit and the other party moves a little bit, more or less, and then they maybe meet in the middle, or maybe to the right, or maybe to the left, but there's some movement. That dynamic may not operate in the same way, or may not operate at all, where a client is a member of the clergy, because many members of the clergy believe they can distinguish, and maybe there are some of you in this room, between right and wrong. And if your position is the right position, it's very difficult to compromise. How can you compromise? I'm right. So that's sort of a general observation. I had occasion to represent in evangelical, I mentioned that I represent people in a number of faith groups. I had occasion to represent an evangelical chaplain in the Navy. The Navy evangelical chaplains are a very litigious group of people. They are. What's that?
That was you. Is that the group of 70? The big ones?
No, I didn't do the big group. I've represented a couple of them. I didn't do the big case. The Navy chaplains, the evangelical chaplains, have done kind of class actions of one kind or another, the case that I'm thinking of, the individual not only was a member of the larger class, but actually had some highly individualized issues, and that's where I came in. And that case gave me a window on the challenges faced by chaplains in dealing with the personnel structure, because the Defense Officer Personnel Management Act is an up or out program with the promotions going to those who are best qualified according to various criteria. But it's quite imperfect, and it's not subject to a lot of judicial review. And that was a window. There you had a particular individual who had been by his lights, and I actually agree. I'll say, by the way, one of the pleasures of my own career has been I virtually never had to represent a party in litigation with which I did not actually personally agree. It happens, and it's all the same to a lawyer. We're just we're the servants of our employers. But this person had been disadvantaged, and it was really the first time I had seriously looked at the personnel side of things, and that's quite important in the conversation that we're having. And I'll just digress, if I can, Shelley, go back to this afternoon's proceedings. It's a nice idea for the center to center left, educational sector to want to send young people, or maybe not so young people, into the chaplaincy. But how long are you planning to send them for? For one tour? 4 years? If that's the case, and that's probably the most likely way that one could make progress from the standpoint of the consultation group here. Remember that the management of the personnel system, meaning promotions in this up or out system, is going to continue to be in the hands of the career cadre. So unless you're willing to somehow adjust the personnel arrangements, the promotion arrangements, putting people into the chaplaincy for, let's say, 4 years, means you're never going to make what I'll call progress in the diversity terms that have inflected the conversation this afternoon the way you want. You'll just have diversity, let's say, for 4 years, and a continuing generation after generation after generation of the equivalent of reserve officers, when there was a draft. Just one or two others. I can remember, forgive me, a number of these stick in my mind because I'm a Jewish person and like most Jews, quite sensitive. We have a fairly good antenna at times. I remember in OCS, there were a number of Jews in Coast Guard OCS at Yorktown, Virginia. It was a wonderful experience. Richard also shared that, I think, the semester before me. He's blocked it out, but I haven't. They still talk about Richard's class, by the way, and not in a favorable way. But I was there in the spring of 1969 when Passover came. Passover was just around the corner. And it was, there were a number of people who, like myself, did not eat leavened products during Passover. And an application was made for some matzah, and the word came back, there will be no Jew food in the dining hall. End quote. I represented a young man who was a lapsed Catholic. He wasn't so young. He was a lieutenant commander. He was the executive officer of the ship. The CO was born again, and the number 3, the ops officer, was also born again. And when the ship pulled into port in Portsmouth, Virginia, the CO and the ops officer would go to services, and this fellow would go off and, have a nice dinner. And that led to friction within the wardroom. I'm giving you sort of, pictures at an exhibition, and I don't, as I do this, I've got 1 or 2 more, but I hope they're instructive. Usually lawyers get involved when things have gone south. That's a sad fact. Lawyers are also capable of being constructive and helping, move things forward and, providing a maybe disinterested perspective. But also we commonly get involved when things have gone wrong. So please don't think that I think that everything is wrong. I don't. But I think that it's important to share these incidents with you. I was a hearing officer for conscientious objectors during the Vietnam War. It was a very interesting experience. In the U.S. Coast Guard, we didn't have a lot of conscientious objectors. Everybody was a conscientious objector. That's true. It was a wonderful, I'm very, very happy to have had the opportunity to serve in the Coast Guard. But, these were remarkable people. Remember, this was a time of conscription. Now, today, there are still conscientious objectors, who sort of pop up and, they have an insight, it's called a crystallizing event, when their views ripen for whatever reason. But even at the time, although most conscientious objection sort of jurisprudence arose during conscription at the front end before you got into the service, people didn't want to be drafted. So that's when they popped up. But there were also in-service conscientious objectors. And I remember one fellow in particular. He was a graduate of UNH. He was a 20-year-old kid from New Hampshire. And he had made rate terrifically. He'd been in for something like 18 months and he was an E5. Right. This guy was terrific. I'm not making this up. He was fabulous. And he had become a conscientious objector, on one of the ships doing North Atlantic patrols. So I asked him, I was the hearing officer, I asked him, what caused the light to go on for you? And he said one day he was on the ship and he looked at the turret. There's a 3-inch 50 naval gun on that generation of Coast Guard cutters. And it had stenciled on it, "Man Killer." It was stenciled right on the turret. And it was seeing that caused him to think, that just was it. Footnote 1. It turns out that "Man Killer" stenciled on a gun turret has nothing to do with killing, people with the bullet. It has to do with the fact that these gun turrets are controlled by radar and can spin in the blink of an eye and knock you overboard.
Safety issue.
It's a safety issue. There it is. The Chaplaincy was mentioned before, quite a remarkable case. And the only thing I'll say about it is, not only was his non-judicial punishment set aside, but he got the medal that he was entitled to. But that was very scary. I'll tell you one story. Shall I tell you one little story about Chaplain? You remember the case? He was the Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo, and he was locked up on suspicion of espionage, and that, you know, the paper said he was subject to a death penalty. He had been held at the Naval Brig in Charleston for quite a while. And I did everything I could. There was a little hearing. Nobody wanted it. Nobody had the nerve to let this guy out. And I decided there was only one thing I could do. It was like 2 days before Thanksgiving. And I wrote a letter to President Bush. It was a nice letter. It was like a 5-page single-spaced letter. And I had a secretary at the time. It was very, you know, it wasn't angry. It was just like, well, you know, what gives you, you know. I remember I told him about a case from the 50s. There was a Major General named Groh, who had been the military attaché in Moscow, who I think got drunk and left his briefcase at a meeting in Warsaw. And the briefcase inevitably had, you know, his diary that had all his secret stuff in it. And he was court-martialed. And he never served a day in prison. And Eisenhower released him and said, you know, no harm, no foul, goodbye. And I mentioned that in my letter to President Bush. At the time, I had a fabulous secretary who had been an E5 in the Air Force. She'd been in some legal office in the Air Force. And she was tremendously intrepid. And all I can tell you is that she was able to confirm that my letter, in fact, had reached the desk of the White House counsel, which I thought was pretty good. You try getting a letter into the White House sometime, you know, in real time. 2 days later, the Army released him from pretrial confinement. So with that by way of background, on to the matter at hand. And let me also say in advance that I really hope that people who have insights or thoughts or objections, I'm really glad we're in this room, by the way, because the seats are fixed in place and no one can throw a chair at me. I want to lay my cards on the table. I'm not clergy, although at one point in my adult life I gave some thought to studying for the rabbinate. I'm also not personally observant, although I try with varying degrees of success to respect Jewish customs and traditions. But I am, and throughout my adult life, have been interested in matters of faith, although I'll add that as a longtime civil libertarian, I come down strongly on the side of separation, as you will see, as you probably have already seen. And finally, I'm a civilian, although I did have the opportunity to serve when I was right out of law school. So with all these disclaimers piled on top of one another, please indulge me. I want to offer a few observations about the chaplaincy and its future. I'll start by saying I have profited from the still timely 2014 Pathways to Military Chaplaincy Call to Action. The paper usefully lays out a series of fundamental issues and creative and realistic ways to approach them. And in large measure, I agree with its description of the challenges facing theologically centrist and leftist-centered seminaries, schools of theology, and divinity schools. Footnote 2. I went to law school at Harvard Law School, and I once heard it observed that it was significant that the only thing between the ROTC building and the cyclotron was the divinity school. Anyway, my own approach comes from a different perspective from the one that the paper presents. I see other challenges that at times intersect with the reality that Ed Wagner described, and at sometimes intersects, and at other times goes off on a different trajectory. It's not a tidy picture, and I hope you will talk me down if any of this strikes you as wide of the mark. First, I believe that chaplaincy has become bloated in both staffing and mission. Second, I believe that chaplaincy as currently conceived is unworkable. Are we having fun yet?
Yes.
Yes. Third, I believe the problems with the chaplaincy pale in comparison with the emerging non-chaplaincy issues of faith within the armed forces of the United States. Before I get to these points, I want to set the stage and share with you why I am basically in a grumpy mood about religion and law in the public sphere more broadly. I could refer you to other cases, but the one I'm going to mention is the case of Town of Greece against Galloway. Who's heard of it? A few. You'll remember it when I continue. It was decided by the Supreme Court a little less than 2 years ago. So the town of Greece conducts important public business through public meetings of the town board. The board made a practice of opening its meetings with the Pledge of Allegiance and a prayer offered by a member of the clergy. The guest chaplains were typically Christian, and the prayers they offered typically reflected that. Board members bowed their heads or made the sign of the cross. Some citizens objected on the ground that the prayers had to be either generic or non-sectarian. The Supreme Court observed, the town made reasonable efforts to identify all of the congregations located within its borders and represented that it would welcome a prayer by any minister or layman who wished to give one. That nearly all of the congregations in town turned out to be Christian does not reflect an aversion or bias on the part of town leaders against minority faiths. So long as the town maintains a policy of non-discrimination, the Supreme Court wrote, the Constitution does not require it to search beyond its borders for non-Christian prayer givers in an effort to achieve religious balancing. The quest to promote a, quote, diversity of religious views would require the town to make wholly inappropriate judgments about the number of religions it should sponsor and the relative frequency with which it should sponsor each, a form of government entanglement with religion that is far more troublesome than the current approach. The majority also wrote this, and I apologize for these quotes, but I don't want to give you just a little snippet that doesn't do justice to this text. Nothing in the record suggests that members of the public are dissuaded from leaving the meeting room during the prayer, arriving late, or even, as happened here, making a later protest. In this case, as in a case called Marsh, board members and constituents are free to enter and leave with little comment and for any number of reasons. Should non-believers choose to exit the room during a prayer that they find distasteful, their absence will not stand out as disrespectful or even noteworthy. And should they remain, their quiet acquiescence will not, in light of our traditions, be interpreted as an agreement with the words or ideas expressed. Neither choice represents an unconstitutional imposition as to mature adults who presumably are not readily susceptible to religious indoctrination or peer pressure. In other words, this is me now, big deal. The court upheld the town of Greece's practice. 4 justices dissented, impelled by the lopsidedly Christian content of the invocations. The dissenters had no problem with prayer as such at town board meetings, a proposition I personally do not agree with. They just thought the town of Greece had gone too far in one direction. In a separate concurring opinion in which he was joined only by the late Justice Antonin Scalia, Justice Samuel Alito referred to the principal dissent's objection as, in the end, really quite niggling. That is a quote. His theory was that the town of Greece is a small town, that its board members almost always have day jobs, and almost never has a legal office, and instead relies for legal advice on a local attorney whose practice is likely to center on such things as land use regulation, contracts, or torts. Full stop. Why do I mention the town of Greece case? It certainly has, on the surface, nothing to do with the military, much less the military chaplaincy. And yet it's relevant because it is a sign of the times. To denigrate the dissenters' concerns as niggling, such a revealing word choice. Justice Alito demonstrated beyond all question the inner world he inhabits. It is a world in which members of minority faiths should suck it up and stop kvetching. I cannot think of a more dispiriting judicial decision, and this is from our nation's highest court, probably the most respected institution in the country. So with that by way of background, let me turn to the 3 propositions I mentioned before, having to do, at last, with faith in arms. My first point was bloat. Perhaps I should call it mission creep. But it's more than that. I submit that the U.S. military has far too many chaplains. I do not know what the current number is for the Air Force Academy. Yes, I know I picked an easy target. But the last time I checked, it seemed to be wildly excessive given the modest size of the Corps of Cadets at that quite small college. My understanding of the proper size of the military chaplaincy is informed by my reading of a case that I imagine everyone here is familiar with to one extent or another, Katkoff against Marsh. That case teaches that the chaplaincy should only be concerned with the pastoral needs of the military workforce that cannot be attended to by civilian houses of worship or clergy. That is what it says. I of course recognize that those needs are unlikely to be met at sea or on most current or foreseeable foreign deployments. But the chaplaincy is going, forgive the expression, great guns in large parts of our country, whereas Army Captain Malcolm Wilkerson suggested 2 years ago in the Oklahoma Law Review, we do not suffer from a dearth of spiritual and religious resources. Beyond this, I do wonder whether part of the size of the various chaplains corps is a function of assigning to chaplains duties that can and therefore should be performed by laypersons or members of other staff elements such as medical personnel and social workers. If this possibility has not been carefully scrutinized, it should be. My second point was to suggest that the current compromise surrounding the chaplaincy is unworkable. My indefatigable friend Art Schultz of Northern Virginia, perhaps you know that name, because he has handled all the Navy class action cases. Art has labored in the legal vineyard for many years on behalf of the evangelical chaplains, and his clients are fortunate to have him. His work, often frustrating, has revealed the impossibility, in my opinion, of meshing the diverse clergy population with the normal arrangements for military personnel management, as I suggested before. It's impossible, in my opinion, for the government to conduct a chaplaincy program without getting embroiled in forbidden issues, such as the recognition of faith groups sponsoring agencies. And yes, I know there are a number of endorsing agencies represented here. How, as well, to protect against sectarian favoritism when promotion boards meet in secret and loyalty among faith group members is a given. It's a reality. For many years, for example, the Navy had a serious mismatch between the representation of faith groups within the chaplaincy and the religious affiliation of non-chaplain personnel. The apparently abandoned thirds policy lasted far longer than it was defensible. But what is the proper policy? The thirds policy was 1/3 of the chaplains would be Catholic, 1/3 would be liturgical Protestant, and 1/3 would be everybody else. What is the proper policy for matching clergy and lay demographics? This is a serious question. I don't really have an answer to it. But how far from a standard ratio can be tolerated? Or is a fairly tight fit, such as we see in the one person, one vote jurisprudence, for example, the goal? And related to this is the recognition that chaplains may be quite unwilling to toe a neutral line when it comes to matters of doctrine, such as preaching about contraception, or abortion, or performing same-sex marriages. You know all these flashpoints. As the notion of the vanilla chaplain fades, are we headed into ever more treacherous seas? My third point was that the problems with the chaplaincy pale in comparison with the non-chaplaincy related issues of faith within the armed forces. And here, I'm going to take my courage in both hands as a layperson and talk about your profession. Lord knows plenty of flashpoints have been generated, often needlessly by the chaplaincy. But let me suggest that the upsurge in religious zeal within the service is such that, as in contemporary American religious life generally, it has to a considerable degree swept past the clergy. push back on this when I'm done, but let me put that out. In a sense, and I do hope that the church scholars in the audience will correct me if I'm drawing a very false analogy. I wonder whether what we're witnessing is a kind of mini Reformation in uniform. And by that I mean where religious energy has unleashed forces that cannot be and are not in fact controlled or even modulated by clergy. Perhaps this is a matter of concern for people of the cloth, and I would very much welcome comments and insights on this. Let me mention some of the matters that lead me to the conclusion that I just proposed. One has to do with an organization, the others are more individualized. The first illustration concerns an organization called the Officers Christian Fellowship. Perhaps some of you are aware of it. I encourage you to examine its website, which states that, quote, OCF's purpose is to glorify God by uniting Christian officers for biblical fellowship and outreach, equipping and encouraging them to minister effectively in the military society. It is a lay-led organization that rests on a conflation of Christian religious zeal and military officership. OCF has active outreach to service academy students and ROTC cadets and midshipmen. Personally, I have no problem with military officers who have strong spiritual lives. But I do have a problem with the close identification of the spiritual and military leadership spheres. In a hierarchical society such as the military, individuals are uniquely subject to pressure and the urge to conform. But the military workforce is not a religious congregation or a faith group. It is a secular entity in our democratic society. The Officers Christian Fellowship is not compatible with that vision. Moreover, it is a lay organization. Perhaps some of you in the audience see it as a different kind of threat. A second development concerns the case of Captain Simratpal Singh, a decorated Army officer who is a Sikh. He recently prevailed in federal district court in Washington in a case concerning whether the Army could subject him to specialized, non-standard testing before acting on his request for religious accommodation with respect to his grooming and appearance. Judge Beryl A. Howell of U.S. District Court granted him a temporary restraining order against the Army, enjoining it from, quote, subjecting him to any non-standard or discriminatory testing for his helmet and gas mask during the pendency of the litigation. My final illustration is not generic the way OCF is. It has to do with a particular individual. I'm referring to the case of United States against Monifa J. Sterling. Raise your hand if that name rings a bell. I imagine you know of it. It's pending at the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, and it will be decided sometime this summer. Lance Corporal Sterling is represented by one of the country's leading conservative appellate advocates, a former Solicitor General of the United States. A variety of friends of the court have also appeared, including one from my own faith group. In a nutshell, the case concerns whether Lance Corporal Sterling could be required to remove 3 stickers with religiously inspired verses from the government-owned computer she shared with another Marine. She refused to do so and was punished for disobedience. Her claim is that she had a free exercise right to do as she wished and could not be punished for disobeying an order to remove the language as a matter of her own religious freedom. I'm not going to predict what the Court of Appeals will do with the Sterling case, although I will bet you. Did clergy ever bet? I will speculate that it ends up at the Supreme Court. Those who are supporting Lance Corporal Sterling in this fight have bigger goals in mind than this isolated case. They see it as an occasion to further shift the boundaries that separate the secular and the sacred. I mention the case here not because I expect to include it in the next edition of the law school textbook I co-edit, but because, as with OCF, the controversy is highly charged, but does not arise from the work of the chaplaincy. That's the point. So I suggest to you that religion in the armed forces has moved past the chaplaincy in important ways, or at least is in the process of doing so. And that is a different, not necessarily deeper, but it's a different problem from the ones that Ed identified in the blueprint that you generated in 2014. So there you have it. I know people in this room to be motivated by only the highest goals and principles. I know that this room is filled with friends of the chaplaincy. I'm one too, within limits. I hope my remarks will draw attention to the contested landscape in which the chaplaincy currently occupies. And to me, the broader picture, frankly, is cause for dismay, even beyond that suggested by the excellent Pathways paper. Thank you very much. Do you want to moderate?
I don't know that I need to be heavy-handed in moderating, but
I'll be heavy-handed in moderating.
Okay, we have about a half an hour for questions, and you feel free to.
So who would like to ask the first question? For my benefit, would you please remind me who you are? And speak up so everybody can hear.
It's too late in the day for me to remember who I am.
You haven't started drinking yet, have you?
No, not yet. Then I'll remember. So my name is Edie Disler, and I'm on the Forum and Retired Air Force. I went into the Air Force during like the Reagan 80s and retired in 2009. And something earlier today, we brought up the fact, and one of my chaplain buddies brought up the fact that we're getting into a situation where we have repeat generation military folks.
Yes.
I'm with the Texas Veterans Commission in my day job. I'm not here officially with that, but that's what I do in my day job. And we talk about a good chunk of the Marine Corps coming from the Rio Grande Valley, right? What the question has to do with, you brought up, your perspective is interesting because you mentioned when we are a conscription force. So I think we keep a lofty ideal of the all-volunteer force, but I don't think we have thought real critically about what that means in terms of self-selection.
Mm-hmm.
So much of what you have talked about has to do with who is self-selecting into the military and why. And I know that I taught at the Air Force Academy in the late 80s and then back again in the 2000s. And the Air Force Academy became known as, if you want to be a proselytizing Christian, you go to the Air Force Academy. That self-select, over time, that became a self-selection for young people going to service academies. So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about the all-volunteer force, the good, bad, and the ugly, in terms of, as you see it, more influence of religion in the military outside of the chaplains.
Yeah. No, I think that's an excellent insight. Personally, I favor the conscription. I think for other reasons, which I will say in one sentence. I favor conscription in order to reconnect the political apparatus of our country with the portion of the population that bears the burden. And semicolon, by the way, that would probably cut back on foreign adventures.
Yes.
And I also, I will say, being the classic conscription era reserve junior officer driven into the military, because of conscription, I'm aware that the received learning among senior officers is that the conscription era was a terrible time because we had all these terrible people that they were not interested in being there. To the extent they got trained, they were getting out as the day after their time was up or the day their time was up, and it was very wasteful, and they were basically a pain in the backside. That if I were in charge, I would say, fine, it's a deal. We'll take it because of the leavening effect of having short time, particularly junior officers who are a source of at times irritation, but also maybe new ideas and the like. Now, in terms of people being drawn in, whether there is a connection between the religious demographics of new accessions into the military workforce and conscription, it's certainly the case. It's got to be the case that, for example, the Air Force is an attractive line of work for people who are evangelical because it's friendly. That's a safe environment in which evangelical fervor is recognized and not disincentivized. I mean, that's got to have some effect. For the rest, I don't really know. And you all who are dealing or have dealt recently in pastoral capacities with GIs are in a much better position than I am to evaluate that. I will say it's very ironic if you think about Katkoff against Marsh and the fact that the chaplaincy really should only be stepping in where the local houses of worship can't fill the pastoral needs. The proposition that Colorado Springs needs, taxpayer-paid, chaplains to fill in the gaps that the local houses of worship are unable to meet is like a ludicrous fraud. Yes, sir.
Why do you think it is that the Supreme Court has not subjected the existence of chaplaincies in the military to strict scrutiny under the statute? You said you're a separationist
I am.
of one sort or another.
Yeah.
Will that happen? Why hasn't it happened?
Well, on one level, it's because the Supreme Court long ago made peace with things like chaplains preaching in Congress, in God We Trust on the coinage. I mean, seriously. And on another level, thanks in large measure to Justice Rehnquist and later Chief Justice Rehnquist, the standard of deference to congressional action with respect to the military is unique. And Rehnquist basically set in concrete a standard that basically says anything goes. Whatever Congress decides, we're not going to second guess Congress when it comes to the military. So that's the short answer. Now, that's not to say that things can't change at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, by the way, don't think of it as a pendulum, because it's not necessarily the case that it's going to swing back on the same plane. It may be something like this. Who knows? Somebody pointed out to me there was a major military case in 1994 where the court was unanimous. Well, that's 1994. It's not that long ago, if you're my age. 6 justices have changed, 6 seats have changed hands since then. 6. So, is that case up for grabs? I actually think not. But, if you wanted to, you could make a run at the court and see if you can dislodge somebody. But it's very hard to get the Supreme Court to change direction. Yes, sir.
A lot of people have concern about the proselytizing issue. Not just that you have two problems where you have a disproportionate number of evangelical extremists, whatever you call them, but more importantly,
I wouldn't call them extremists. Let me also, I want to be very direct about this. I have no doubt about the personal sincerity of evangelical Christians, and it is my understanding that part of their belief system is to witness. That's part of the charter. That's part of being a good Christian. So, that's the problem. It's not something you can say, well, these people are making it up, or that, this is not really Christian. Whatever. It's genuinely held. Okay.
Suggesting that
I just wanted to make sure we were in the same.
in addition to the disproportionate number of chaplains in those denominations, you've got the problem where they're proselytizing as a requirement by their endorsers and then doing something discriminatory. Have you had any cases pertaining to the proselytization issue? And then from a constitutional standpoint, how much is that a threat to the existence of the chaplaincy with respect to establishment of the office?
Well, let me say this. I had a professor once who said it's one of the strengths of American society that we actually tend not to get down to the ultimate fundamental issues. We tend to sublimate them somehow or avoid them. There are a million different issues, doctrines, and this may be one of them. But I think that if you follow the trajectory that I have proposed, that I've posited, is the word I really want, there would be a train wreck. There would be a train wreck because of those values. Now, I mentioned a case where there was a highly energized commanding officer who basically was conducting mandatory Bible study groups. Bible study groups, prayer breakfast. Prayer breakfasts. What could be more innocent than a prayer breakfast? I don't know if I have too thin a skin on that because I'm a member of a minority religion, and that is the case. But I have to say that when I heard that the admirals at Coast Guard headquarters were having regular prayer breakfast, I thought, what the hell is that about? Pardon my French. It just makes me uncomfortable. But have I gotten close to your question? If not, put it to me again.
And there are cases where there's been objection to proselytizing and the equivalent of that.
It's usually, I believe, subtler than that. In other words, it's not. It's the problem of the exec on the ship that is not going to services when the ship ties up in Portsmouth. Well, how do no, the executive commander, you don't have to go with us. It's fine. Go out and have your steak dinner. It's fine. Now, tomorrow I have to write your fitness report. And there's so much judgment involved. Everybody knows that performance evaluations are highly discretionary, highly subjective. And yes, there may be numbers and blocks and ways to sort of regularize it, and you can figure out, or the government can figure, the management can figure out what your grading curve is, and is this one an outrider, and maybe there was some, some incidents that give it away. But a clever superior can write a damning evaluation that will have no fingerprints on it. Kristen,
So I'm wondering if part of the
speak up, Kristen, please.
So I'm wondering if part of the distinction in the civilian world is when we have religious behaviors, we believe that it's an exception to the protocol of what's going on, but in the military, there's not an exception to the protocol.
Well, spell that out for me again.
So in the military, if a chaplain if you're being invited to do something of a religious nature, the chaplain is an officer, and you're having to behave in a way that's set within the unit, so when you do something, it's affecting the rest of your behavior in the unit. So it's not like you can get off to go to a Sabbath service. If something is determined to be mission essential on Saturday, if you want to go to a Sabbath service on Saturday, you have to get special permission not to do it. So if you have to regularly get not permission to do it, all of a sudden you're breaking unit cohesion.
Well, you're out of step. You're simply out of step. So I'll answer you with a vignette, an anecdote. And I know Richard remembers this. Anybody here remember Up With People? Nice group, right? Music. So Up With People was active in the Tidewater area in Virginia, which is loaded with military installations, all branches and all that. And Up With People had a program where they would visit Coast Guard OCS. And it was great. It was really nice. After a long week, you're there, you're feeling sort of bummed out. And this is, why am I doing this now? And so it was nice. And they would do a program on Friday night. And no, there was no chapel, and nobody went to church or synagogue, during OCS. It was 17 weeks, you got it over with, fine. But it was Friday night. And the deal was that you could go or not go, because people were aware that there was something vaguely religious prestigious-y about up with people. So you could go or not go. Okay, that's a deal, right? Accommodation, fine. You want to opt out, opt out. What if you opted out? If you opted out, you were back in the barracks, shining the bright work with the brasso and making all the, doing the decks and swabbing and, polishing the handle on the big front door. So nobody did that. Everybody went to see Up with People. And myself included. And I will say I had a wonderful time at OCS. In 1969, the U.S. Coast Guard OCS was like, it was a fabulous collection of people. No, it was like summer camp with the best graduate students you could possibly imagine. I mean, do the math. I mean, it was a wonderful group. Yeah, Richard said that everybody had a master's degree. In my platoon, there were people who were all but dissertation. There were lawyers. There were a few enlisted men. It was all men at that point. The few enlisted men who were coming up through the hose pipe. But it was a wonderful group. And there were a handful of Jews in my company. And again, I don't mean to dwell on this, but this is my personal experience, and you can discount it or not. And people knew that I was, a quite strongly identifying Jew. And friends in my platoon, as it became apparent as the Up With People show went on, that it really was rather Christological or, Christian inflected. That's all. It didn't hit you over the head, but it wasn't hard to figure that out. And a number of people came up to me and said, God, this is real. I feel so bad that, you have to sit through this. And I decided, I'm just going to step outside during intermission and, I'll just be in the lobby. In the lobby, there was an intermission, and there was a wave Lieutenant J.G., who I think was like the impresaria for this show. And she said, so OC, what do you think of the show? Isn't this great? And I said, well, actually, ma'am, I think this is unconstitutional. I just graduated from Harvard Law School, there's hot stuff, I think it's unconstitutional. And she looked at me like I had just landed from Mars. And I do think it was unconstitutional. Sue me. Next question. Ed, you already had one. Who else? Otherwise, we have to hear from Ed someone. Come on. Yes, ma'am.
So to honor religious accommodations, and I'm not sure if it's the appropriate session to ask.
Speak up a little bit. I'm sorry.
Sure. So for Muslims going through basic training, they're not given time off on Fridays to go to prayer and within the religious edict. You shouldn't, as a male, miss more than 3 consecutive Fridays. And so it's become problematic. And so the chaplains that are there, they don't even know, to go to a chaplain so the chaplain can advocate for their freedom of religion or religious rights. So should the government be sued? How would that get resolved?
If I were asked to consult on that, what I would like to know is how other democratic societies that have substantial Muslim populations deal with this. I'd like to know that information.
The day
Societies.
off. It's the day off.
Well, you're telling me something I don't know. I don't know how South Africa or India deal with that. I would want to know that. I'm not. There, at least the beginning of training. I'm just trying to remember back, and some of you are much more invested in the nitty-gritty of the training environment. But I think there is a period of time when everybody has to pitch in all the time. It's 24/7, maybe for a week or 10 days, and then you get liberty for after a couple of weeks. That's my impression. I think it's a real problem if you have a deeply based a deeply doctrinally based prohibition or injunction to refrain from labor on the day. I think that's one reason why Orthodox Jews are not, suited as a practical matter for military service, because the U.S. government does not come to give them a week off. Now, it would be interesting to me to know, and I don't know what the answer to this is, how during the conscription era, the U.S. government dealt with Orthodox draftees. I just don't know. I just don't know. But, you're leaning on an open door with me on this issue. I mean, I think there's a lot more the government could do to accommodate. I mean, why did this Sikh officer have to sue the government? For something that's a no-brainer. I mean, seriously.
And the irony of that is each individual that want to have religious accommodation for the turban and each individual must sue the government. It can't be just one for a collective.
You could bring a class action. You could bring a class action. But you'd have, you'd need a good plaintiff, and
Are you
I
up for
have
hire?
my hands full at the moment. Right, as soon as I'm done with Sergeant Bergdahl's case, call me. Yes, sir. We have time, so.
Yeah, I have a question in regards to a conflict between the exercise of religious freedom by a chaplain and a service member. They come to conflict, and I hate to use this word, which one trumps?
That's a huge question. We didn't set this up, by the way. What do you think?
I would say that we are there, chaplains are there, really to provide for the servicemen. That's the way it should go. If there's a conflict, I think the service members should, not the chaplain.
Well, I think if a chaplain cannot provide services on the terms that the government has to prescribe in order to vindicate the interest of the congregant, then the chaplain should should find some other pulpit.
That's the way it's supposed to work. If he raises this issue of the witness, the Great Commission.
Yeah, the Great Commission.
Great Commission. They're supposed to witness the people.
I had a great commission. The lieutenant commander is a great commission. But that was lowercase. It wasn't uppercase.
But I got the sense from
Come on, we're being serious here. There's so much laughter.
But I get the impression it is probably false. You think it's okay for them to be out there, witnessing to the troops. But I think that's
Chaplains?
Yeah, I think that's
I'm deeply troubled by it. I'm deeply troubled by it. And the reason I'm deeply troubled is the military is, in fact, a different society. Its operating system is different. It is hierarchical. Obedience is obedience and conformity are the watchword. It is not normal society. And so the usual rules that we would apply, where every individual has basically agency, do not obtain.
But don't you think that also creates a potential situation where the establishment clause enters in? If you've got these guys witnessing, are they not then part of the establishment clause? Would that not be a way to attack the chaplaincy and get rid of it?
Oh,
Wait, say that again?
Yeah.
yeah.
Suppose we were an evil genius, and we wanted to do away with the chaplains, legally, how would you do it? And that is,
Well, if you're there acting as an agent of the government and advancing one religion over another
Yeah.
religion, then you got a constitutional issue of establishment. This is the government supporting one religion at the cost of other religions. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
I-
why
yeah.
couldn't I bring a lawsuit and say,
Well, you can always bring a lawsuit.
Oh, I know, but you gotta win. You gotta win your case. You gotta win your fees.
No, I mean, it's things like that, it's scenarios like that that make me suggest that this, there is a danger that if things are not somewhat kept in check, there will be a train wreck, and at the end of it, there won't be a chaplaincy.
That's my concern.
that should be very disturbing, and that's a real incentive. That's a real incentive to, exercise some control, even though there are going to be people who are going to be very dissatisfied. Chaplain Klingenschmidt is not going to be a happy camper. He's not a happy camper. Yes, sir.
I want to get back to the issue raised about religious accommodation, because the same issue came up not in a Muslim context, but in a Jewish context at our endorsers meetings, and one of the Orthodox rabbis asked Father Hurley, the chief chaplains for the Army, why is it so many of the rabbis attending the chaplain basic course are given a hard time about religious accommodation for the Sabbath? And Chaplain Hurley acted as if it was the first he'd ever heard of it. And I elbowed my boss. We'd go up and talk to him in the hallway and say, no, our Seventh-day Adventist chaplains, it's like every other commandant seems to forget that the chaplain school should be modeling religious accommodation and should understand there are some groups, like Sabbatarians, that you can predict that they're going to have some needs for some specific accommodations.
Yeah.
And this rabbi in particular, he says, our rabbis go to the chaplain school and they're not treated like, sometimes like they're religious professionals. He says, shouldn't the chaplain school be a model of how to care for people of different faiths?
So you would think. In my casebook, with some friends, I have a casebook on military justice, and one of the cases involves a guy who was a Jehovah's Witness, and he was the cook.
Yes.
You know the case? You know the
I've
case.
read that in your book.
Yeah, it's a wonderful case, and he was the only cook on this small cutter. It was fortuitously. The world does not revolve around the U.S. Coast Guard. I want to tell you that. So whatever impression you have tonight.
That's how that got in your text.
There's only
No, how could you
35,000.
read? What's that?
There's only 35,000.
Yeah, maybe 40. On a big day. On a big day. I think it's smaller than the New York Police Department. So,
It is.
yeah. But we have more ships. So this fellow was the only mess cook on this little Coast Guard cutter. And in fact, as you know, we have a picture of this little buoy tender in the book to hammer home the point that, they didn't really have a choice. And in that case, he refused to work on the Sabbath, and he was punished for disobedience. But, that case could have been avoided. Usually these cases can be avoided. And some of the issues, and just to talk about teaching this subject, and I try to teach about religion in the military in my military justice class. Some of the materials are really fascinating. For example, I'll give you a few illustrations very, very quickly. A Canadian officer feels that he should not have to remove his hat during a prayer. Protestant, that wasn't his thing. We have a case from Fiji, where, who here is Methodist? There's some Methodists. There was a member of the Royal Fiji Military Force. Yes. They're actually a profit center to the government because they go on all these UN missions, troop contingent. Yeah, it's a fact. So this fellow was a very, committed Methodist. And there came a time when the king of Fiji, this is before they threw out the king, the king of Fiji was hosting an official royal visit by a Thai princess. And what do you do in Fiji when you have royalty visiting? I mean, you have all the guards and everybody, the guys who are wearing their garments, and there's the welcoming dance. The dance is a little suggestive. And the dancers, I think, are not like fully clad. And this Methodist Fijian took great offense, and he was prosecuted for it. And I believe at the end of the day, he said, I don't want any part of this, and he objected to doing it. And at the end of the day, I think he prevailed on that. There was a case from South Africa. There's something called, there's some ritual object that one wears on one's wrist, and I don't know for sure how to pronounce it, Isfanbla, an Isfanbla, that has some, spiritual or religious value, and he was ordered to remove it. These are fights that people get into that are very unwise on the part of management. That case went away. Their Court of Military Appeals in South Africa said, no, look, forget it. Just get rid of this. And that's how so many of these things should be resolved. But I mention these things because these issues do come up. They do come up everywhere. That's what makes life interesting. All right, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yes, sir.
Just real quickly, I happened to sit in on a presentation to a number of endorsers a couple years back where they had an attorney from the Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF, and then also an attorney from the Beckett Fund.
What is ADF? What is
Alliance Defending
Freedom, yeah, it's a right-wing conservative organization of lawyers that defends,
their position is that there's a war on Christianity? Is that the,
yeah,
okay,
right.
yeah, all right,
And they opine very publicly, the two of them together, two different organizations, two different attorneys, that reach the same conclusion, that the military chaplaincy would always be safe and preserved for the very fact that it predated the Constitution, the military chaplaincy. It predated the Constitution, and by virtue of that, it had cultural tenure, for lack of a better term, within the military and within this country, and that nothing could go against the chaplaincy to dissolve it.
Because it exists
That was
outside the
Chambers.
Constitution?
That was Chambers.
Yeah.
And I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
I had a wonderful history professor.
Well, actually, the Army chaplaincy was around, during the Continental Army.
I had a wonderful history professor in college who had been, who's German, but he'd been educated in England, and every once in a while he'd use a Britishism, one of which was flapdoodle. I've never heard it anywhere else, I've never seen it in writing, but that sounds to me like flapdoodle. I don't know what the Aramaic is for flapdoodle.
I'm gonna push back on one of your points.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Somebody's pushed back.
There's one in every crowd.
So, on what grounds would you pare back chaplaincy duties? On what grounds? And by what criteria do you get the paring back done?
Yeah. Well, I want to linger over that because it's a serious question. The grounds on which I would, I can actually give you a phrase. There's a phrase that shows up in some actually military cases. There's a case called U.S. Ex Rel. Toth against Quarles from the 50s. It's a Justice Black opinion. Black, by the way, is wonderful reading. I mean, much of his jurisprudence has been gutted, but it's great reading. The phrase is that military jurisdiction should be the least possible power necessary to the end proposed. Least possible power. And if you show me that there's a kind of magnetic pull of emanating, forgive me, I'm getting a little poetic here, but emanating or based in the Establishment Clause, then I will say that imposes effectively it imposes a limit. It causes a sort of gravitational pull or a bit of a presumption against anything other than core pastoral functions. That's
the ground.
That's the ground. That's question one. Where would I draw the line? You all probably know that. Let's turn Ed's question around. What are core pastoral functions? The administration of sacraments. I'm just, let's take it down to bare metal. What is it that you, hold on, that you, honest to Pete, need a member of the clergy to do? Your sacraments, not leading services per se, right? You could have a lay leader. What else?
But then
Um,
that's denominational.
Yes,
Denominationally specific.
but can you imagine a regulation in a DOD, some DOD directive that said, it would be an interesting drafting exercise. Write a regulation that prescribes the functions of chaplains.
Confidentiality.
That would be, well, that would be an attribute.
But nobody else in the unit has it.
No, that's not, the lawyers have it too, psychiatrists have it. Yeah, no, they do.
Well, they do.
Sir?
They have it, but it is not the same.
Fine,
They have
okay.
reporting requirements.
Yeah.
They have what?
They have reporting requirements, mandated reporting standards for all doctors,
So it's
whereas.
only
Doctors, there's no doctor-patient privilege in the military. There is for shrinks, there is for,
No, there's
the victim advocates, the special victims council, or victim advocates, I think, there's Rule 514, but what are the core functions?
We need chaplains.
Is confession a sacrament?
For some functions, yes.
So I mean, you could, sir? Yeah, so you can have a list, and all of them would, you could, qualify all of them as saying, the following are, when required by the faith group of the what? Of the chaplain or of the congregant, the following. It's not that hard. Sir?
One of the challenges, as I listen, is that everything that we have been discussing deals with what in the military and chaplaincy they would call at the tactical level,
Yeah.
providing religious
Yeah.
support.
Yes.
And as you go on in your career in chaplaincy, your trajectory starts moving more and more away from religious support in what you do and how you function, and more in an advisement capacity to command. And so all of a sudden, the questions change a little bit in how it affects a lot of the topics that we're talking about. Maybe still, they're still pertinent topics, but the way, kind of questions about their function and how they live that out.
Well, let me ask this. Let me ask this. If a person becomes, let's say, an 06 chaplain, and is the, a division chaplain, what are the functions of a division chaplain other than, let's say, supervising subordinate chaplains? And that's, that I get. And being a line chaplain like every other chaplain, so that if somebody comes to you or you're on the watch list, Father Smith, you've got the watch 7 o'clock Sunday morning for confession, it's your turn. Are there pastoral obligations to a senior commander?
There's also
Hold on, if they're pastoral obligations, fine, that'll be in the Wagner regulation. If you're serving as a personnel advisor, you don't need an endorsing agency, and you don't need your core device to be, to render personnel advice. So that's outside the Wagner regulation.
What about religious leader liaison?
What does that mean?
Chaplain's gotta fill that in. Somebody should be talking about that, that's another whole.
And operational, I think at the strategic level kinds of roles, you have more and more expectation of religious leader engagement than you do. And when I say that, it could be in a foreign country,
What does it
Could
mean?
it be in a, you know, in different ways,
mean, that's
because I think we're starting to learn that our own compartmentalization, our tendency toward trying to compartmentalize religious practice so much in the United States is a foreign concept in most of the countries where we are spending time. And it's much more embedded.
You mean chaplain corps to chaplain corps interactions?
Well,
In some
they may or
cases.
may not be chaplains, but that, the same idea of chaplain, relationship building with religious leadership of other countries.
Let me say this, I think that, Ed's gonna kill me for this. Because I've described this as the Wagner rule, and I don't mean to,
I'll tell you when you're wrong.
to link you to this. But in all seriousness, you know, when I teach, I will sometimes say in the middle of the class, all right, your homework tonight is write me a regulation, I teach federal Indian law. Write me a regulation on who can be a member of the Commonwealth Avenue tribe. You know, and the kids go home and then they come in 2 days later and they, you know, some of them have written something that looks like something like a regulation, some of them have not, but you know, it would be a very interesting drafting exercise, Ed, to have a blackboard and to say, okay, let's clean this blackboard off, what do we want in the regulation? And I'm sure there is such a regulation. I wonder what the chaplain's manual, I've got you in 1 second. I wonder what the chaplain's manual says about this, because trust me, I've spent 45 years reading military regulations. There's a regulation, or 4 of them, for everything. And I would be interested, it might be an interesting exercise, well, it can't be done tonight, but maybe somebody can go online and find the current Wagner regulation from some branch of the service, it's online, and see what it says about the functions of chaplains. It would be really interesting. Maybe somebody could do that and hand it out tomorrow. Okay, all right, we're now over time, but yeah, I want to see the hands right now. You, sir, one in the back. You already spoke, but I'll give you the last word quickly. Trevor.
Sir, my name's Matt Woodbury. I'm an active duty Army chaplain. I am an 06. I am a senior advisor.
I could say, that's all right, I'll talk slowly.
Yeah. I was also the managing editor for a significant revision of Joint Publication 1-05, Religious Affairs and Joint Operations.
Beautiful.
Which was a collaboration among all the service chiefs and chaplains to come up with this exact idea
Fabulous.
that you have. And the reason why we did this revision was because traditionally, I'm trying to be obtuse here a little bit, there was understood that one of the roles of the chaplain was to serve as a liaison between the command and the local population. And we've seen that happen, we've seen it happen in the United States, in all sorts of different places. And then in World War II, we saw where, you know, chaplains would work with clergy in Europe, they would work with clergy in other places. And so this capability of clergy-to-clergy interaction was seen as an asset by commanders. Then when
The occupation situation is a special case. I will grant that, but
well,
you know,
so,
I'm skeptical outside of that.
Well, and I understand your skepticism, as are many chaplains about this. To my friend's point here a moment ago, in a lot of that exists, started out of a, if you will, a tactical application of that idea in Afghanistan and Iraq, where in an effort to mitigate the use of violence, commanders would want to gain the confidence of the local population and would send chaplains to interact with imams.
Christian chaplains?
Yes, Christian chaplains or Jewish chaplains or Muslim chaplains to interact with imams in the area. And I'm trying to be as objective as I can. I have an opinion about this. I was a brigade chaplain in Iraq, was given the order to send my battalion chaplain. I'll give you an anecdote. You've been really good with yours. I will give you one of mine.
I make mine up, but
Yeah. Well, you won't know whether I made mine up or not.
Incidentally, I want to say one thing, and I think if this was said at the beginning, you know, of the program, I may have missed it, but let me say, I assume that the ground rules are that all of everyone's comments are only in their individual capacity. That nobody is speaking for their group. If it wasn't said, I'm sure that's everybody's understanding. Let me just say that.
So my anecdote is that we had deployed to Iraq. I actually refused the order to send my chaplains out.
Huh.
And what we did instead was we brought all the imams in. And my commander was the one that interacted with imams. I was there in the room, and he pointed to me as, I have a religious leader too. This is my religious leader. What are your concerns? So I've never had the personal interaction. That's how my brigade and ultimately the division, it became the policy of the division. But at any rate, other brigades did not, other divisions did not, and had varying levels of. So we returned home. We went to do as usual, redeploy. Then we start training, and then we go to the field to exercise. It was in Hohenfels, Germany. There was 18 inches of snow on the ground, and we're doing a Baghdad scenario, so it was a little bit surreal. But one of the scenarios.
Assume the desert.
Exactly. And one of the scenarios that came up was an imam comes to the gate and says, "I want to meet with the commander." And so we used our standard operation procedure, which was to bring all the religious leaders in and to interview them in the presence of a commander, the most senior ranking person they could talk to. And a chaplain would serve as, if nothing else, just a symbol that we have religious leaders too, but not to do the actual interaction. And it just so happened that night, during the after action of that particular scenario, one of the commanding generals, one of the deputy commanding generals for the division was there, and he looked over at me and he goes, "Matt, do you think that your chaplains are able to do interaction, liaison with local religious leaders?" And it was late, and I had been, all these disclaimers here, I was really tired, okay? And I said, "Sir, my chaplains can't spell Baptist, much less know the difference between Shia and Sunni." But truth spoken out of exhaustion, because the truth of the matter was, it's a very discreet skill to engage with people at this religious level. Nevertheless, though, as you move up and with greater education and greater skills would be developed, to help commanders think through the religious implications of the things that they're doing, and vice versa, the implications of religion on the military operations.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
Well, and keep in mind, it's not just in a combative situation or a conflict. This is humanitarian aid, disaster relief, earthquakes, tsunamis, all that kind of things that we do.
Right.
We're chaplains.
Right. But you were talking about religious leader liaison, and that's a slightly different.
I mean, we're in mission creep country. That's the question. You know.
Because then you're seeing a person as a subject matter expert, as much as a sacramental.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, all right, I think we're probably going to wrap it up. Thank you so much, and thank you.